On this episode of Money and Power, we talk about wedding cakes, it's my party and I didn't really invite you anyway, and the great red global threat. But first, Kid Ink.
I got the money and the power. Yeah. Once you get a little, they just want to take you down, cuz we've been going hard for too long. Can't get enough, what is you on? Yeah. Really ain't nothing I could drop that. Wake up in the morning, make it all okay.
Welcome to episode 8 of Money and Power, our weekly look at questions related to finance, politics, and culture. I'm your host, Nathan Martin, and joining me from Michigan, a financial consultant and host of the Rob Talks Money podcast, Rob Johnson.
Howdy.
Also joining us from here in Ohio, a contributing analyst with Wikistrat, Greg Lawson.
Hi there. Glad to be on.
Well, glad to have you. So, as you guys can tell, Jeremiah is not with us this week. The next couple weeks he has military duty, so he's going to be off doing that. He might be able to give us a recording here or there, but we'll see. But we reached out to a good friend of mine. We met probably 4 or 5 years ago now, if even not longer. Time flies when you're having fun. But he's a really good mind when it comes to stuff on foreign policy. So we're going to kind of discuss some stuff for that for our main topic. So he's coming along for the ride. Early in his career, he nearly joined the U.S. Foreign Service, and he continues to engage in his passion for foreign policy and history through participation in programs to strengthen ties between the United States and Turkey, travel, and his affiliation with global internet-based geopolitical consulting organizations. So that's just a quick little bio of how good of a guy he is. So again, Greg, thank you very much for joining us.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much.
And so I reached out to him, Rob, and I was like, so can you join our podcast? And he's like, tell me a little bit about your podcast. And I was, I basically said, well, we talk about some serious stuff, but then we kind of go a little bit wacky. So I reached out to Greg to see if he'd be willing to join us, and I'm glad he did. Early on in his career, he nearly joined the U.S. Foreign Service. He continues to engage in his passion for foreign policy and history through participation in programs to strengthen ties between the United States and Turkey, travel, and his affiliation with a global internet-based geopolitical consulting organization. So I tell you what, Rob, I have some of the coolest friends, and one of the joys of having this podcast is just being able to bring them in and introduce them to my wider set of friends. So really glad to have you, Greg. Thank you for coming.
Thank you very much for having me. Looking forward to it.
So your friends seem to be a lot more diverse than mine. I mean, mine's kind of like mailroom, and if you said the word geopolitical, they would not know what the hell that even means. So that's pretty interesting.
Yeah. I do have. Listen. My friends are a lot cooler than I am. So that's. People don't want to listen to me bloviate in a podcast, but they'll listen to all my friends. So it's all good. So we have a great show for you guys out there. We're going to be talking about China and maybe get into some tariff talks and stuff like that. So definitely going to get into the serious stuff today and kind of the world stage altering stuff today. But this time is not that time, because now it is time for our look back at the weird, the inane, and the general happenings going on in the world by the crazy people who happen to live here. News bits.
News bits. Show me your bits of news.
Still the worst jingle ever. That makes me happy. So, all right. Rob, what do you got?
Yeah, so as some of the listeners may know, I am a pretty hardcore Eagles fan. So they won the Super Bowl this year, which was very, very good for me. So today, breaking news, if you will, Trump has uninvited the Philadelphia Eagles from the White House. So generally, when a national sports team wins any kind of title, the president, it's usually standard, invites the team, coaches, and whatnot to the White House for just for a little ceremony. And the last couple of years, it's been in all sports pretty much. It's been kind of getting less and less just because of how Trump's relationship is with athletes, which to say the least is not good. So basically, what happened was the Eagles were a part of the sideline conversation as far as what was going on with the national anthem and the protests. Some of their players were. And when the NFL ruled unilaterally that all teams had to stand for the national anthem or they could stay in the locker room, the Eagles weren't too happy about that. And because of that, a lot of that was brought about from Trump. They said, you know what, we're just going to send a smaller segment of our team because a lot of our players aren't interested in going. They don't have a lot of respect for Trump. So they were going to send a smaller faction of their team so they could still go there and still see the fans and whatnot. And Trump had uninvited them upon hearing that because they disagree with what he said as far as him saying they need to stand proudly for the national anthem, hand on their heart, and all that jazz. The president continues to spread the false narrative that players are anti-military. So all of those things are important, but the last one I think is very important. So from the NFL players' perspective, they're not anti-military. It's kind of their mode to protest things that are going on. Now I don't agree with how they're doing it, but on the same side, I don't agree that Trump should be influencing the NFL and a private organization anyway. I don't think that's a part of his job. I think he has much more important things going on than worrying about what NFL players are doing and how the NFL should legislate. Even now, he's still tweeting to them, you shouldn't be allowed to go and hide in the locker room. It's like, what? I mean, first of all, he's not necessarily the most patriotic person either. You could point to several things that he's done that's a bit off, that he's asking other people to do that he does not do. So it's really interesting to see how the president of the United States, the highest office in the free world, is getting involved with these NFL players as if that's the primary concern on the agenda when there are far more things that he needs to spend his attention on.
Yeah, so from my perspective, it's kind of interesting because I don't know. It's weird. The Philadelphia Eagles, not a single player knelt during the anthem this last season. And then you also got the weird bit that Fox News did because they ran the story, but then they found pictures of Philadelphia Eagles kneeling, but they happened to be kneeling, praying after a game, which is commonplace, but even more so with the Philadelphia Eagles because they actually have quite a few players that are professing Christians. In fact, one of the players got baptized in one of their hotel pools, and the team all attended. Not the whole team, but a big contingent of the team attended. So it seems really odd, the thing. So I did see that 80 people had RSVP'd and it went down to 10. And I think that caused kind of the consternation. But I don't know. Sometimes I just feel that it's pettiness. Like I don't, I mean, I kind of understand where he's coming. I kind of understand how he would feel, insulted, but at the same time, like it's a level of pettiness that I would hope for more from my leaders. I don't know. I might be kind of going a little bit off there, but I don't know. Greg, what are your thoughts?
Well, I think this is an interesting experiment in political gamesmanship. And I will say, I think that the president is proving to be quite politically sophisticated with this because he knows that this plays well to a lot of people who feel that it wasn't as much about the Eagles per se as it was the entire perception of the NFL. And I think he was trying to sort of do a spike in the end zone on the to some extent with what the NFL did with the modifications to the policy. And I think he's recognizes that this is a seam in American political life, and that there are, for years, there's a lot of people who feel that, sports, whatever you might think about the various sports, not just the NFL, but a lot of these athletes are highly compensated, and it's disrespectful to do that. They can say it's not being against the military, but that's what that's what a lot of people think. And so I think he is, from a purely political situation in terms of how he plays to a lot of folks that support him, I think this is going to play well. Now, I think the Fox News thing was pretty bizarre and deeply problematic. I mean, you're literally using images of people doing exactly what you want people to be doing, and using that in a way. Now, that, if I understand correctly, they did come out to apologize after it was apparently exposed that that's what those videos were from.
They did.
But I mean, it is pretty absurd and wrong that they did that in the first place. But Trump, I mean, I think the thing we have to understand about the president is he understands his base. He understands how a lot of middle America, that silent majority that he even calls them the silent majority, kind of like Nixon used to call people back in '68 and stuff like that when the country was going through tough times. And I think he knows how to exploit that and play to people who feel like they've been silenced. And these NFL protests from last year and the Kaepernick stuff and everything else, it plays to this sense that a lot of Americans have that there are a bunch of elites out there who are denigrating things that they value, and that they are denigrating patriotism. And so I look at that and I say, wow, he's really playing to that. People say, oh, that's so wrong. It's so, and maybe in some sense it is petty. In the other sense, it's extremely skillful because it continues to consolidate the bond or reinforce the bond he already has with a lot of people who feel, I think, disenfranchised from what they think is the elite opinion makers. And I think, pro athletes to some extent, they're not exactly Hollywood, the Hollywood movie makers, but they do represent that kind of left-leaning sort of polite society, political correctness crowd. So whatever you think about what the legitimacy is of the NFL, what they're trying to talk about with the issues of the police and everything else, Trump knows that this is something that really rubs at the nerve of a great chunk of Americans, in middle America at least.
That actually leads to a really good question, though, Greg. I think you are correct. I think that the president does play to his base, but the question is there a point where that level of political savvy can actually be detrimental to the office you're holding, because of its perceived pettiness by others? And I'll concede that I think you're correct in your assessment, and I'm not even quite sure I have an answer for the question. I'm trying not to be leading with it, but is there a point where that level of pettiness, even if it plays well to the base, like, is there a point where it's just not worth playing up to the base?
I think I do think there is that point. I'm not exactly sure when that is reached. I think this is one of the great challenges that we kind of face, unfortunately, today, at least domestically, is that we sort of reverted to tribalism. And I think it's becoming a pretty common topic to discuss that. You heard that with Ben Rhodes was talking about in his book about the world or the way it was, or whatever the book was that Ben Rhodes, one of Obama's foreign policy guys, was talking about, that President Obama was saying after Trump got elected that, maybe people don't want the cosmopolitanism. Maybe they just want to embrace their tribal elements. And I think that's a little facile and looking down on folks. But I think that's the challenge is that I think we were already sort of going in this direction. Trump is sort of, I've never thought of Trump as the problem. I've always sort of seen Trump as a symptom of the deeper malaise. And he is the most skillful at branding, and he is really talented at that. Naming people through Twitter pejorative names to denigrate people that he has disagreements with. I think the problem is that it was already there. I think Trump is using the power of the office in a way that hasn't really been done before. But I think that we have to ask ourselves the deeper question of why is it that so many people are disaffected in the first place? So yes, I think it does potentially do some damage to that. But I mean, whoever becomes president is starting to become the leader of a tribe anyway. I mean, if you remember how George W. Bush barely won Ohio in 2004, and there was a lot of ramifications because that. Well, I mean, there was actually let's go back to 2000 and the hanging chads. It was that's not my president because of the Florida recount. Then when he beats Kerry in 2004, he's not our president again. There were shenanigans in Ohio with the Secretary of State cheating or doing things like that. It became very tribal. And then Obama was our president for certain segments of the population. And so I think what you're seeing is just the natural devolution, actually, to the constituent parts that we have in America. And so I think it is problematic. But I don't believe it started with Trump. I think he is just the most, as of today, the most extreme example of a process that we've been sort of witnessing for some time. And I'm not sure how we change it. This is the problem. People retreat to their tribes because they feel more comfortable there. They feel safer there because they feel like they're being attacked by other people. They feel like they're the deplorables, right? That Hillary would call them, or the people, and I think we're going to talk about it later, but the people who would be forced to go against their private religious they're not their private, but their religious convictions and be forced to do that by state action. And so it's tribalism. I mean, we're seeing it just pop up all over the place. And I think it is a problem. But I think it's a problem that far is broader than Trump himself. He's just obviously the most famous person.
Yeah, and I think that he's just the recent example of it. I would agree with that. I think that the not my president started during the George W. Bush terms. And I think that's the first time that we actually started seeing that. Even during the Clinton years, he was never not my president. My parents never talked like that. Nobody around me really talked like that. Not my president. Bob Dole. Woohoo! You know what I'm saying? Like there wasn't any of that deep tribalism that excluded what we had all in common as Americans. And I remember the first time that I really experienced that was when I was with Vets on the Hill, I think in 2000, I want to say 2007, 2008 range in Washington, D.C. And someone said, I was talking about the president with a protester there in D.C., and they said, well, he's not my president. And I said, oh, so you're not American, then I'm sorry, I was misunderstood. And I kind of said it tongue in cheek, and they got absolutely flustered. But to me, it was like he's all of our presidents. But then you started seeing it on the flip side during the Obama years, where there were definitely people on our side of the aisle who had that same opinion that President Obama is not my president, and that's why even during the quote unquote Obama years, I would try to be very careful that I always refer to him as President Obama and not Obama in my own discourse, just because I wanted to kind of remind myself to ward against that. But now you're seeing it kind of flip, and I wonder if we're in kind of a cascading of it's just going to flip flop. That's not healthy long term, and I don't know.
Well,
I don't know how to go about fixing it.
I'm going to make an interesting suggestion that'll be a segue into our broader topic for later. But I'm going to make one of the things that has concerned me is we have turned inward on tearing ourselves apart. And there were already challenges. I don't want to minimize some of the problems we had during the Cold War when we were confronting the Soviet Union. But if you think about it, the Cold War and the struggle that entailed, there were obviously third columns, there were spies, there were efforts at propaganda and things like that. But there was also a certain togetherness that Americans had that we have not had since 1991 and the collapse of the Soviet Union. And I would submit that, ironically enough, we are tearing ourselves apart because we are focusing on a lot of very parochial issues, and there's the identity politics and the hyphenation of America, and a lot of these, some of the result of the radicalism of the 60s and the takeover of most public universities with a particular philosophical predisposition. I mean, look at most state schools, state colleges. If you look at the faculty, they're 3, 4 to 1, liberals, progressives, even to conservatives, Democrats, Republicans. And I think what you're seeing is this just reverberate. Trump is a backlash against that, and because a lot of people have felt that Republicans are weak-kneed and give up too easily, and people were ready for somebody who would push back and was able to do it. And Trump is juvenile in some of the things he says and does, and petty and petulant, but people like it because they think that he's defending their values in the face of people who would basically take a leak on them. And I think that's striking and problematic, and it is going to go back and forth. And I think this plays very poorly into the big picture geopolitical competitions that we probably face here in the 21st century. And it's very disturbing to me. And I think it's going to play a big role in the outcome of those competitions.
Absolutely. And I'll disagree with the Warriors and the Cavs. The problem is that people think that they're bigger than the office itself, and that's kind of an ego thing.
Well, they're also interestingly enough, they're playing into Trump's hands. I mean, when they do this, it gives him the opportunity to do exactly what he wants to do. And if they don't like him so much, they probably don't want to give him some of the very tools he's going to use to activate the very people that helped him win the White House in states that hadn't historically gone Republican in decades. I mean, this is going to play well in West Virginia. This is going to play well in certain segments in Wisconsin and Michigan. I think it plays well in all over Ohio. I mean, Trump is extraordinarily popular still in Ohio, far more popular than the average Republican. I mean, not even close in Ohio. And so, he may be not looked at kindly on the coast, but this really plays to what he wants. He wants this. That's why he stokes this, and they're literally letting him. He own them in a sense by doing it this way. I think so. From that standpoint, it's not going to work out well for him.
Yeah, that's a great discussion, and I think that we're going to have more of it as we get closer to the midterms. All right, Greg, what's your news bit?
Well, June 6th is upon us, and that's a very special day. It's the 74th anniversary of D-Day. So June 6th is the day that, of course, the Allies began the liberation of Europe nearly 3/4 of a century ago. And I think it's so important for folks to remember what that meant, liberating France from the totalitarian ideology of Nazism. It was an incredible day, but it was a bloody day for Americans, as well as our allies, the British, as we stormed there in Operation Overlord, the beaches of Normandy. And, you remember President Reagan giving his famous speech about the boys of Pointe du Hoc, which is actually still there. They still have the mangled up casements and areas where the German soldiers were, and they were hit by the naval forces. It's an amazing thing, and I think it's just a great time to reflect upon how far we've come, but then still, a lot of shadows from World War II and that history, still shapes things to this day. But nearly 3/4 of a century ago, it's a great historical monument to liberty, freedom, and also defeat of tyranny.
Yeah, and along those lines, we had talked about this a little bit on our last episode dealing with Memorial Day with Jason Beardsley. It's important for us to understand that the further that we get away from these events historically, the more we take them for granted, and also don't feel that they really resonate as much as they do in our current era. And I think that is why it's important to kind of stop and reflect on these dates and things as they kind of tick by every single year.
I could not agree more. I'm a big fan of history. I think it informs so much and shapes the world we live in. If you don't understand that, you kind of miss out on understanding how we got to where we are today. And these are great. These are titanic events, and we're obviously losing a lot of the great veterans now that would have been fighting in World War II. That generation is passing, and so I don't know, just great. I always think about honoring them. We have where I live, we have for Memorial Day, they have a very nice. They put out hundreds and hundreds of flags in one of our local parks as an honor to honor it. They have a number of other monuments that they erect over the weekend, and it was a great experience for me to do that. That's why I kind of kept coming back to D-Day. Is just such an important thing for the U.S. history and for the people who sacrificed there.
Yeah, when it comes to flashpoints, not necessarily flashpoints is not necessarily the right word. It's like crossroads of human history, and where we could have gone one route or another. I think D-Day has to be up there. I saw something on Twitter that it was Eisenhower's letter to be delivered if the D-Day had failed. And it was just pretty stark to read the humility from a really good general, but the humility of being able to say, this failure is on me and on me alone, and writing it before it even occurred. It's just I think it speaks to just the encapsulation of that era. Rob?
Yeah, so I saw one thing that was being cycled on social media about this, June 6th. It's called the Fallen 9000 Project. And I guess this originally came about in 2013. And it's a tribute to the 9,000 civilians, allies who lost their lives during D-Day. So what they do is they go to the beach of Normandy and they kind of stencil out 9,000 silhouettes in the beach. It's kind of a neat thing that all these people took on, just to remember, the price that people pay, so these things can, so freedom can occur, so countries can be liberated, and it's just a neat project. So it's called the Fallen 9000. If you want to look into it more, it's pretty neat.
No, that sounds fascinating. That's an awesome effort as a tribute.
Yeah, and if you look at it. It's an art installation, but it's a temporary installation, obviously, because it gets washed away in hours. But they had so many volunteers come out and do it. But just seeing the number of silhouettes on the beach was just fascinating. It almost looked like a bunch of shadows.
Yeah, when the photo that's on the website is about probably 30 yards in the air, and it spans the entire. Probably at least a mile, and you can still see silhouettes down at the end of the frame. I mean, it's amazing how many, it's breathtaking, actually. I mean, it kind of leaves me speechless as I look at it. It's just fascinating.
So where do you guys stand on Dunkirk? Did you guys like the movie? Did you guys see the movie? Did you like it?
Didn't see it.
I did see it, and I'm actually a big fan of Chris Nolan movies as well. Who directed it, of course. I thought it was a very good movie. It was very different. I actually think that watching it and was it The Darkest Hour or The Darkest Hours, the Churchill movie that Gary Oldman won the Oscar for playing Churchill.
Yeah.
I think those are great movies to go in tandem with each other because what I thought the movie of Dunkirk did well was look at it in a very this is kind of the experience of the soldiers there. It wasn't quite the opening sequence to Saving Private Ryan. I don't know if there's ever been a more powerful way of displaying the terror and the bad things that happened than that first few minutes of Private Ryan. But I thought overall the movie did really well with that. And whereas the Churchill movie kind of talks about the politics of it and the framework of it and how that situation sort of was emerging with Churchill having to stand up in his own government. So I think they worked so well together that I really liked them working together much better even now that I watched both of them than I did individually, because I like big picture history. So I like kind of understanding why these things are happening. And
Yeah.
Dunkirk doesn't do any of that. So it's meant to be, I think, more gut impactful. And I think it was very successful at doing. So I definitely think it was a good movie.
Yeah, I remember going and seeing Saving Private Ryan in the theater, and the only thing I really remember, I obviously remember the whole thing, but I remember that after that scene, when they cut to the next frame, the opening scene, when they cut to the next frame, my body just relaxing because of the intensity of it. It was crazy.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, I've never seen a depiction like that of war. I mean, that's the standard, I think, especially for that incident.
all right, so my news bit is there was some big news handed down by SCOTUS this week. The Supreme Court came up with a 7-2 decision in the Masterpiece Cake Shop Ltd. Versus Colorado Civil Rights Commission, and it's been talked about kind of ad nauseum over the last couple of days, but it is a signal. I wouldn't say it's a big win for religious liberty because they kind of skirted away from the primary issue there. But it is it could have been a lot worse. If we would have lost that case, I think it would have been kind of a death knell of religious liberty as we know it in the United States. And so it's a very good win. Specifically, that it was amazing to kind of read the majority decision on this and see that the thinking and rationale, like they compared this baker. So for those who don't know, Masterpiece Cake Shop was owned by a Christian businessman who, Jack Phillips, who he did not want to use his artistic ability in creating custom cakes for a gay wedding. Now, he ended up telling the couple, they said, if you want anything on my shelves, you're more than welcome. If you want any of my cakes that are already done, you're more than welcome. But I cannot do a custom cake for the wedding because that violates my religious convictions. And so obviously this went all the way through. But the Civil Rights Commission in Colorado basically compared him to the same as being a Nazi or being a slaveholder. And as that came to light, the justices basically said that, you know what, that is the government taking a negative view of someone's religious beliefs. And that's unacceptable. And so he should have that ability, especially since that same commission approved other cake shops denying service to white supremacy groups and also groups that supported traditional marriage. So there was obviously a double standard, which we've known for a long time. But the biggest thing out of this, and kind of what I wanted to touch on, is that the justices basically wrote, you know what, this religious persecution actually exists. It exists. And there is an animus towards religious folks that this couple kind of went out of their way to Target, Masterpiece Cake Shop. This Jack Phillips is pretty much, he's in business but barely because of this whole process. And the commission itself was seeking to kind of destroy this individual. And so kind of what I wanted to focus on, talk about, is not necessarily the case itself, but I just kind of wanted to speak to the Christian progressives out there who are constantly kind of mocking whenever we bring up that there is religious persecution or people that are being targeted. They kind of mock it. And, to those who are in those shoes, you need to understand that this stuff is real. And it is a shame that you're not willing to stand next to your Christian brethren who are going through something, even if you don't necessarily understand it, but you don't even want to understand it because you're basically create a mockery of it. So if you could stop that, that'd be greatly appreciated. So that's kind of my two-bit rant on that one. But I do think it is a short step, and obviously there's going to be other cases that are going to come down the pike. Rob, did you have any thoughts on that?
Yes, I was looking at this quite a bit today, and I think it's a small win. I don't think it's as big as a lot of people are reporting it to be. The biggest part that I see is that even though they sided 7-2, they still reaffirmed the state's rights to be able to curb discrimination through businesses, which some would argue is a violation of the First Amendment. Now, there's a huge discussion to be had on that. I mean, that's more than I can distill in 1 minute. But I think that's something worth noting in this case, is that they still affirm that states can kind of curve discrimination, even though it's your business and you ought to be able to run it the way you want. The states can still tell you what to do and what not to do as far as who you can and can't sell to. And I think that, if you open up a cake shop and you are an out-and-out racist, the market will put you out of business faster than the government will. So I'm a big believer in the market correcting these things rather than having the government to do that. So that's my .02 on that.
Greg, you have any thoughts on that?
Oh, yeah, sorry. No, I would echo a lot of that. I think the market is the best place to resolve those kind of issues. I think that the case was certainly, I think it was essential that it was decided. That it would have been a huge loss had it gone the other way. But I don't think it was as big of a win for a lot of the reasons that have already been talked about. I think it opens the door to states still being able to do things that really they shouldn't be doing in terms of forcing people through that. And I think that this is, again, just sort of one more salvo in the ongoing culture fight that I guess we kind of are going through. And I don't think the fundamental question was at all answered. And I think they actually went to great pains to avoid answering it. And I don't think you would have had Stephen Breyer and Elena Kagan, two more liberal justices on the Supreme Court, choosing in the side of the majority if they thought this was going to do significant damage to, I think, their position.
Right. And, it was kind of funny to me that, Justice Kennedy, in the majority opinion, he actually went out of his way to say twice that, if the commission had just denied that they actually did these things, that it might have been a different outcome. But they outright told the truth. And it's kind of like, what? I don't. Okay. Like, why would you put that in a majority opinion? So it was definitely not it's not the best case scenario, but it's definitely not the worst case scenario. And I think that it would have, if that issue had been pressed, it would have been probably a 5-4 in the opposite ruling, and that would have been disastrous. So I will take it, and we'll fight another day. I do echo, though, that governments should not be able to enforce these things the way that they are, and then as long as they lie about it and how they're going to treat people with animus, then everything's okay. So it's definitely up in the air there. So we'll see. A lot more to come, I'm sure. This is just, again, one case of many that are coming down the pike, and hopefully this ruling will cause some changes, but I'm not as confident in that as some of my other friends would be.
Yeah, I don't know. I think the masterpiece cake. I mean, I think we avoided a bad decision, but it's not overly exciting, I don't think.
So, Greg, as we look at the landscape of kind of the geopolitical world that we are in right now, let's talk a little bit about China. That's kind of why I wanted to bring you in here and talk about. But first, I kind of want to talk about why does it not seem that people have a sense of urgency when it comes to China, even though they're kind of blatant in some of the things that they have going on?
I think that we don't. I think there's a number of things. I think the first big thing is that we get so much stuff from China. Ever since we've been doing trading with China, really since the 70s, and Nixon and Kissinger going to China and opening to China. And it started off as a kind of a purely geopolitical move back then in the context of the Cold War and working with China to counter the Soviet Union at the time. But since then, it's really become about trade and companies. And I think businesses, many businesses want access to the market in China. And I think that when big business wants to, China makes it clear what they expect from big business, and big business tends to do what the Chinese government wants. Otherwise, they don't get access to, 1.3, 1.4 billion people. I mean, that's what, 3-4 times, not quite, maybe 4 times. Well, yeah, probably about 4 times, between 3 and 4 times the population of the United States. That's a lot of people. And I think that businesses are, to some extent, complicit in not wanting things to go too far in terms of allowing people to feel too negatively about China. I remember they changed China. You remember they did the remake to Red Dawn, and it was supposed to be China initially, and they ended up changing it to North Korea for the remake of that classic or cheesy or however you want to look at it 80s movie that was the Soviet Union in the first one. But they did that because they wanted to sell the movie in China, and they knew they couldn't if they had a negative, obviously, depiction of them. Right. So I think that's a big thing. And I think the other thing is that China is smart. They take a very long view of policy. And yes, they've been getting more aggressive lately, but as aggressive as they've been getting, they haven't done what other countries have done. They haven't invaded, like Kuwait, like Saddam did. They haven't outright publicly said, I'm going to waste a whole village like Muammar Gaddafi did back in 2000, whatever that was, I guess 10 and 11, during the Arab Spring. They haven't committed a obvious terrorist attack where lots of Americans have been killed, like obviously 9/11. They haven't taken, well, they kind of have taken some territory. We can get into that too, but they haven't done it the same way that Russia did relative to Crimea and Ukraine. So, you've got all of these things, and I think they keep it below the surface. So I think it's a combination of people like buying cheap stuff. Companies want access to the market so they don't talk badly about China. And they have been careful to keep their provocations below the threshold through which people typically demand some sort of response.
So let's talk a little bit then about kind of this administration's response when it comes to kind of a couple things. One, it's been kind of I don't know, made known, the worst kept secret, I don't know, that we're not going to challenge China as a currency manipulator, and I think that some of that was so we could get some pressure on, pressure on North Korea from the Chinese, and I think some of that's been actually beneficial in that region. But then there's other issues with some Chinese companies in American markets, and also the tariffs that are kind of going through when it comes to that. So, what's really the state of our relationship? It seems that sometimes it's adversarial. Sometimes it seems it's more cooperative in the region, simply because we're not taking an adversarial role in that area.
Well, I think that we have a little bit of a multiple personality disorder when it comes to how we approach China, for a lot of the reasons that I was talking about before. And I think that's why you see sort of a swinging back and forth. You've got, for example, you've got the Pentagon, which is now labeled China along with Russia, a strategic competitor. Secretary of Defense Mattis was just at a big defense kind of get together in Singapore, ironically enough, given the next week is when President Trump and Kim Jong-un are going to meet each other. But Mattis was very stout in his defense of navigating the sea, the South China Sea and the waterways, and pushing back on China. And in fact, I believe the new admiral for the Pacific Fleet, or the Indo-Pacific Fleet, I think they've just renamed it, has said that China is one of the greatest challenges. So you've got this whole thing in the Pentagon where they see it that way. But I think you see it differently from the business side of things. You've got, guys like Larry Kudlow and I guess the Secretary of the Treasury, Mnuchin, who are much more, free trade, Wall Street kind of approaches to things. And so when you look at the economic side, they have a different perspective. And I think that's the problem that America's had is, Bill Clinton once called them the butchers of Beijing because of the Tiananmen Square massacre. And of course, he got elected just like 2 or 3 years after Tiananmen Square massacre happened. But then he led the charge for China to become a member of the World Trade Organization under his administration, and became quite close to China. We haven't made the final decision as to what we want to do about China. We want to have our cake and eat it too. We also, I think, have believed, a lot of policy-making elites have believed that as China gets into the WTO, as they become part of the quote-unquote global system of trade, that they would inevitably, their political system would evolve into something more like ours, a more not only capitalist economically, but also a more democratic system. And I think a lot of the policymakers have held on to that view. It's really only been since Trump has been in the White House. And over the last, well, that might be a little exaggeration, but around that time and just a year or so before, that people really started saying, well, wait a minute, maybe this isn't what's really going to happen. Maybe China's never going to evolve the way that we in the quote unquote West have expected them to evolve. And I think that it is a rude awakening that is just now permeating the people who make our policy across the board. But it's been a real problem. It's a real problem because we're not being very consistent. And Trump's not being consistent. I mean, I think you alluded to it. He didn't call him a currency manipulator. He also cut a deal with ZTE, a very big mobile technology company here. But there's a lot of concern that they are, when they build phones and help construct phones, that they may be spying on Americans right now. I mean, you could have a phone that maybe is sending information back to China. I don't know. It's not inconceivable that that could happen when you look at some of the technology that they're deploying on their own people in China right now, that they would be doing stuff like that. We know they do a lot of industrial espionage and send a lot of students to universities to take back intellectual property stuff back to China when they go back. So I think the problem is that we have never to accept that China is truly a strategic competitor, and to develop a policy that really deals with that in its totality requires making significant trade-offs with certain economic policies. And I think that we've never had a whole of government approach to doing that, because it is in some sense more complicated than it was even with the Soviet Union, because there's so much more economic interlinkage. I mean, we really didn't. I mean, there was some trade with the Soviet Union, but nothing like what it is, obviously, with China.
Right. And so let's speak a little bit to that. So the we'll call it the Pollyannish view, is that, as the markets get open more, China will naturally have and get more political freedom. But can you speak kind of to for the average Chinese citizen, what does their outlook look like right now under this current, and I'll say regime, I guess is the only way to really put it. How is he different, and what are their prospects, and do we feel that we have any kind of responsibility for their prospects for freedom?
I think in the long run, we in the West, and I think in America, we're very optimistic people, because of our own history, despite some of the challenges we were talking about earlier in the program, domestically. But I think that optimism sort of is that we sort of assume that that people kind of do, or we used to at least assume that people kind of wanted to be like us. But I don't think that's necessarily where we're at with China. I think China, there's obviously going to be some people who want to be westernized, and there's going to be people who do like that and want that. But I think in general, you've got a civilization. People forget this is a 2,000-year-old civilization. We think of them as communist. But you also have to think about that they've been resurrecting Confucian thinking in China in recent years. They're trying to create sort of a synthesis of classical Chinese philosophy intermixed with sprinklings of communism and Maoism, to create sort of an indigenous thing that evokes their cultural history, a cultural history that goes back at least as far as Greeks and the stuff that makes up the Western canon.
Right.
I think they want to be respected on their own terms. Certainly that's what I think Xi Jinping, the current president and potentially president for life, wants. But I think that young people want it too. I think that there's pride that comes with that. Some of it's the typical kind of nationalist pride that you see periodically in many different countries, not exclusively, obviously, China. But I think with China, they have a history that's longer than pretty much anybody else on Earth. And I think they want their place in the sun. They want their respect. They don't feel like they've been respected for the last century or so, going back to colonialism, going back to the British and opium and the Opium Wars of the 1800s, where the British, in a certain sense, got them hooked on opium because they wouldn't trade anything else. So tons of people got hooked on drugs. And so that happened, and then they had a civil war, and then the Japanese invaded. And they've had a really rough 150 years. And I think they say to themselves, but before that, we were the big boys. We were the central power in Asia. We should be that again. And now we're back, and we have an economy to prove it. So I think the people like that kind of vision. It's a vision that brings them pride. They're kind of rising up from having gone through incalculable suffering, really, in the 20th century between the fall of the last Chinese dynasty in the beginning of the century, to the Civil War, to the Japanese invasion, to Mao Zedong taking over, and you had one of the greatest famines in human history with his Great Leap Forward programs in the 50s. It's just one thing after another, stuff that really is of amazing loss of life and suffering. And yet, within a generation, They're the second largest economy in the world, and everybody assumes, and probably quite rightly, they'll be larger than ours within a decade. For the first time since the 1800s, there'll be a country besides the United States with the largest economy in the world, and it'll be them.
And so let's kind of speak to that future. Are they, so one line of thinking that I've heard is that they really don't want world conquest. They really want to just propel themselves in their own region and sphere of influence. And so unlike, other quote unquote threats of totalitarianism or regimes, that, we should be okay with this kind of duplicitous relationship. Do you think that there's validity to that? And if not, then where do you see that relationship really going long term if we don't really start looking at them as a global competitor?
Well, I think, there have been various dynasties throughout Chinese history. So I think that there have been times where they were more expansionist. I mean, now, to be fair, they never did some of the colonial things that we know the European powers did. They didn't do that, but they did invade. For example, they've invaded Vietnam several times over the centuries. In fact, Vietnam has some real problems with China. It's actually why we now have a better relationship with Vietnam and are sending ships to dock in Vietnam, naval vessels there this year even, as part of our relationship. So there is a history of China being able to be somewhat expansionist. And I think they also, the more power you get, the bigger your eyes get too. We struggled. The United States didn't initially want it, and then we kind of grew as our economy grew and as things happened. We too sort of grew into a global role that perhaps you would not have envisioned when John Quincy Adams, was saying we don't go abroad searching for monsters to destroy. But in point of fact, we now have and have been for several decades. So I think that you have to stand to reason that it's very likely that they will, in fact, want to expand their influence. And they're going to almost have to. The more their economy grows, the more they expand. And you've got there's this big thing called the One Belt, One Road initiative. That's a big policy for President Xi. That is sort of like the Marshall Plan was back in World War II or post-World War II for Europe when we helped bail out the Europeans after the aftermath of the war to kind of get them back on their feet, to block them from going communist. Xi is talking about this massive infrastructure, trillion of dollars to build pipelines, trains across the entire Eurasian landmass from literally, Mongolia way out east on East Asia, all the way to Europe, all the way to Paris, or maybe even theoretically all the way to Spain. This is a big vision they have. And if you look it up, you can Google it, One Belt, One Road, or the Silk Roads Initiative, as sometimes it's called. This is massive. This is a massive geoeconomic plan and geopolitical plan. You can't say that if you start making those kind of investments that you're not going to have influence in all those countries. And once you start getting influence in those countries, you're going to want them to start doing things your way so that you can make money and have safe investments. So they're going to, by virtue of the growth, even if they didn't want to be kind of neo-imperialist, they're going to become neo-imperialist if they grow. I'm not sure how you can get away from that. I think that's how history shows. Every rise and fall of every empire tends to follow somewhat similar patterns, and they're kind of in an upswing. They went through a bad time, and they're now sort of waxing rather than waning. And for us, I think the real question is, we've never faced a competitor with the multifaceted challenge that China presents to the United States. Germany, whether it was the Germany of World War I, or whether it was Nazi Germany, or even the Soviet Union, they were all significant military threats. And certainly the Soviet Union with their nuclear weapons was a massive existential threat. But their economy ultimately never was the threat. China has the potential to both be a military challenge that could be almost on par with us and have an economy that could eclipse us and buy allies across the region or across, again, Eurasia.
So
this is something this is unknown territory for us. We've never had to deal with this.
So there's kind of two barriers to that I see. So I'd like your kind of thought pattern on that. So the first barrier, I think, is internal. Eventually, you're going to have a citizenry that has a significant buying power, significant quote unquote freedom, but not really freedom, right? And so that is going to start causing some bit of unrest. I feel. I don't think that can continue unabated. They've been pretty smart so far, but I just don't see how that can abide forever. I think the other one, and this is one that I don't think is talked about much, but I do feel that if the United States ceases becoming that power, it will always be, in the number 2 spot. But what does that do for Islamic terrorism? And when does China and Chinese interests start becoming a target of more of that? Especially considering their proximity to those regions. So those two things, I think, can hamper that growth projection naturally, and that's without any real U.S. involvement. What do you think about those two kind of scenarios as I laid out, and do you think that those are at all feasible barriers?
Yes, and actually, I'll even throw in a third one that is happening even in the absence of the U.S., although the U.S. would be a massive force multiplier, which is you create a countervailing or counterbalance with other countries, Japan, South Korea, Philippines, Vietnam, India, potentially. You see some of this stuff where they start banding together because they do get worried about the Chinese growth and the potential that China could bully them around. So even if you didn't have the U.S. in that mix, they would be having relationships amongst themselves to confront this. So that's a third thing. But I'll take each one of those. I think that you're right, that we believe that the pattern of history is that you get the kind of a middle class with buying power. They start demanding certain political reforms. I think that's been the Western and the European kind of mentality. I don't know exactly that has always been the case throughout all of Asia, and that's necessarily there's a somewhat less individualistic, more communal sort of philosophy throughout Asia, just a different paradigm of viewing things. The other thing I'll say is, so I think it could create some problems. I don't think that those problems are insurmountable for a dedicated regime. And I'll point to an issue that I think kind of answers both that and the question of potential radical Islam. They already have a problem with radical Islam in one of their provinces in the west of China. In fact, it kind of borders some of the stands in Central Asia. It's a province called Xinjiang. And there's a very large ethnic minority there that are not the ethnic Han people, that is what most of China is. These are more Turkic people, steppe nomads, and people who ended up sort of migrating to this area over the centuries. And so they actually speak more of a dialect that's similar to Turkish. And they are Muslim. They're called the Uyghurs. And they're a very significant population in that province. Well, that also happens to be where there's a lot of domestic oil for China. And it also happens to be where they get all their oil and gas from Russia through this province. They are constructing right now what I would say is 1984 for real. A police state that may be the most sophisticated police state in history. They are developing the ability to monitor people in ways that you couldn't even have gotten from the KGB or the Gestapo in Nazi Germany. They are actually, there's a great story in The Economist that's out right now, which is a good news journal, on this situation, and it's really shocking. They think that between 500,000 and 1 million of the Uyghur population are in re-education camps right now, today, in China, being basically pushed to shift away from Islam because they've had terrorist incidents with certain pushback from the domestic Uyghurs in Xinjiang. And they will not countenance that because, A, it's a terrorist problem, B, it's an important area that they need for their economic development as they embrace things like that Silk Roads initiative I mentioned earlier. So they're literally building things. They've actually got a picture in the article of a satellite picture where there's nothing there. And 1 year, there's an entire complex that's been built almost overnight, right? And they believe that this is like a camp that they literally put people in. They have police convenience stations, like I forget how many things, but they put cities in grids, and they're like basically on every other street corner. And if you're traveling by bus through different areas in the province, you have to stop at multiple security checkpoints, and you have to turn over your cell phone, and they download every piece of information that you have on there to monitor your texts, any social media activity that you might have. And you have mandatory health checkups. What do? Collect your biometric information. They're doing this right now, today, in Xinjiang. I don't see why it's hard to conclude that they would not. They have an incentive to do it because there's a different population there and they're concerned. But I'm not sure why they wouldn't, if they were concerned about threats elsewhere, why they wouldn't necessarily do this. And this is pretty heavy-handed, but there's even more subtle things that they can do. They have facial recognition technology. They have things, and not even in that province, but things where if you jaywalk, they put your picture on a big screen TV across the street right now. They are building a social capital system, which is sort of a glorified social network, where if you don't, they monitor your profiles and you get scores. And if you get good scores, so you basically don't say anything that the government doesn't want you to say, you get preferential treatment, special benefits. And then, of course, if you do, you lose those things. So what they're doing is, instead of cracking people's heads the way authoritarians used to, they're going to go after people and slowly modify them and do this by dripping the benefits out every bit as much as doing the hard stuff. And the reason I went into so much detail with this is because this is extremely sophisticated stuff. It's almost the kind of stuff, probably not as bad as North Korea. We hear the horror stories in North Korea, but it's kind of amazing how broad this is. And this is not happening in a third world country anymore. I mean, there's elements of China that are third world, but this is now happening in a country with the second largest economy in the world, soon to be the number one economy. That is a fundamentally different scenario for the world than what we've ever seen. I mean, even Nazi Germany, and again, the Soviet Union never had. They had economies more powerful than some, but they weren't that powerful. So marrying the economy to that kind of technology, very concerning. And it does have more than a few parallels to 1984. So I think that they're going to manage their Muslim separatist and terrorist problem more effectively than we sometimes have in the United States. And I think that they will also have that at their disposal to take care of any unrest should it pop up.
Well, that's because they don't have any civil liberties protections, and you couple that with like WeChat, right? And the kind of the all-encompassing nature of that, where it pays for your medical stuff and you go to the grocery store with it, and it's kind of like a Facebook app meets Google meets Apple. Like it's amazing technology, but it's also very cumbersome for anyone who's opposed to the regime. And it's not to say that they're necessarily even cracking down hard now. They're setting up the premise and the ability for them to be able to do so. And so we're having discussions about Facebook and Google and privacy and all this stuff here in the United States, but they have the same reason for concern, but it's a pseudo governmental owned agency that's doing it.
Yeah, they don't have much debate about it over there.
Yeah,
it's pretty well decided, and I think that's the challenge is that it's an experiment that we don't now. I will say that there's another issue that I've just kind of popped in my head that I should have mentioned. There is the argument that they're going to get old before they get rich. Because of the one-child policy that they just recently got rid of. There's a big demographic imbalance. They're going to have a lot of old people, and they don't have as good Social Security quote-unquote programs. So you could end up with a situation where they lose some of their dynamism from the economic standpoint before they're able to represent the full spectrum challenge that I've sort of been painting. And I think that may have a negative impact on some of what they do. So that is another thing that we probably do need to kind of monitor. But that also isn't something that's going to make them unable to project any power. And I think that kind of tying back to the very beginning of our program, this is one of the reasons I actually am very concerned about a lot of our domestic problems. I think that we have a lot of innate ability and talents and great government system and credible natural resources. We have an ability to come together as a people that would allow us to, I think, be able to meet this challenge we've done it before. But the more domestic fractiousness we have, the more we're going to have a hard time projecting strength into the South China Sea or the East China Sea, and a lot of the places where China is taking advantage and building the islands and putting military outposts there and all the things that we see them doing. If we are so distracted at home, and maybe distracted a little bit by other things like, say, Russia or the Middle East, they'll have positions of strength that is a fait accompli before we've even pushed back enough. And then even if they encounter some of these other problems, they will already have the advantageous position within the region. I think that is what concerns me, is they're very strategic. Kissinger wrote a book about China called On China, not a very original title, but he's the only American that I know of who's met every Chinese leader of the modern communist state. He's met them all. In fact, every time there's a Chinese leader who comes here, they always have a private meeting with Kissinger before they meet the president or whoever else it is. And he always talked about that China plays a game called Wei Qi, or Go. I don't know. Are you familiar with that game?
A little bit, but yeah.
And it is vastly different than chess. And what's so interesting about it is it starts with an open board, and you have to put pieces on the board. And it's a much larger board than chess. You can put them anywhere, but it takes a long time before you realize the pattern that your opponent is using is intended to break your guys from connecting with each other and to subtly surround you, but for you to not recognize their sort of positioning until they've already got you in a position where you're not able to break out from where they've put the noose around your neck. And that is something where they accumulate their advantages in small incremental ways, again, below the radar, like I was talking about before. And before you realize it, they have kind of the, relatively speaking, high ground, which is a bad place you have a hard time fighting when the enemy has the high ground. And I think that's where we are facing. We have some very critical, the next couple of decades are absolutely indispensable, because these are the decades where they're either going to accumulate those advantages or they're not. I think they have a very good chance of being able to accumulate enough of them that they'll be able to dictate terms of trade throughout a good chunk of East Asia. And I think that once they've done that, that creates some real problems for us in terms of what do we do as a global power.
Right. So you mentioned that the next couple decades are vitally important for us. So what are some initial strategic steps that you think we should be focusing on? So just some like brief action points that you think that we should focus on policy wise, and what can we do to ensure that our leadership is focused on it?
Well, I think for one thing, I'm going to give President Trump credit for this. I think that Trump has upended the conventional wisdom on China in a way that nobody else really has. And I think it's interesting because before Nixon died, of course, Nixon opened the door to China. He actually was quoted as wondering whether we had created a Frankenstein's monster with China. So he was very questioning of the opening to China after the Soviet Union had fallen. He was wondering if we should have shifted our position on China back then. Well, we didn't. We doubled down on it, the WTO and also I was talking about before. So Trump has raised these questions, and he, with the tariffs, which I don't agree with him applying tariffs to our allies. I think that's not necessarily a good move for a whole host of reasons. But on China, I think that there makes some sense here, and he's really highlighting it, and he's taken a more aggressive rhetorical position than a lot of other presidents have. So I think that's good, and I think that's a start. But I think that we have to be pretty serious in terms of prioritizing it. If we're going to say that China is truly potentially our great challenge for the next 25, 30 years, then we have to act like it. And when you act like it, that means you have to put your resources there. So I would submit that we're going to have that we should downgrade our presence in Europe and the Middle East, and we should focus much, much more on East Asia. I would submit that we should find a modus vivendi with Russia and not get into a Cold War 2.0 with Vladimir Putin. You don't have to like Putin. He's never going to be our friend. But the one thing I think that we are doing that is incredibly myopic strategically is through our sanctions and all of the kind of anti-Russia hysteria because of the 2016 election, is we are constantly pushing Russia into China's arms as an energy appendage to China. Russia is actually, the great threat of Russia, I think, is their weakness, not their strength. We need Russia not to be a permanent ally to China. We need them to be able to pivot between us and China. So really our geopolitical strategy should be focus on East Asia, build the Navy up, which Trump's talking about doing, to over 300 ships, not necessarily all carriers. We may need more modular type ships that can sub in and out with different types of equipment on them and be smaller. Obviously, there's a lot of talk of swarm technology. I mean, there's all kinds of stuff with that, but the Navy is indispensable. And then focus our diplomacy on creating pivot players all around the Chinese periphery. Russia's one of the biggest ones. Japan isn't really a pivot player. They're going to pretty much be probably anti-China for the most part because of their own complex history with China. India has a complex history with China, but we need them to be a pivot player. Really, we want them to be more allied to us, but they're not. India's going to look out for their own interests, but we want them to always pivot between us and China. And then I think we also, I think actually working with North Korea. I think a peace treaty with North Korea, irrespective of the nuclear issue per se, could play some dividends to the extent that North Korea, I freely admit they're going to play us off of China. They're going to do that. Kim Jong-un is going to do that. But that's better than having them be allied to China because it will always make China nervous to have unsettled situations around their border. We should look to have a bunch of pivot players, I call them, countries that aren't necessarily allied to us, but that don't stay allied to China. I think that's extremely important to have all of that and to build it. So we should really work to develop that. We probably need to do some consolidating of our alliance structure in East Asia because they're going to be the people who face China as they try to expand out through their Navy. So we need to work with Japan. One of the areas I did disagree with the president on is the Trans-Pacific Partnership. I think that it was a geopolitical issue as much as an economic one. China wasn't even a party to the Trans-Pacific Partnership. I think that we should engage in maybe not that exact agreement, but a modification of that agreement so that we can continue to stay economically tied to those allies in Asia as also a counterweight to China as they try to go out. And I think another interesting thing is what we don't want is China digging in deep to the Middle East and being able to, build all these pipelines and do all the oil and stuff across the land like that. I mean, that's what they want. They want access to Middle Eastern oil. And the Middle East is having some challenges today. And I think that we have to ask ourselves, do we need stability in the Middle East, or does instability actually redound to our benefit in the long run by creating some challenges with oil and gas in the region? I mean, we have our own domestic supply now in a way that's unheard of. We may need to reevaluate the historical perception that, we got to stabilize the Middle East. Well, if the oil prices get higher, who does that hurt the most? Does it hurt us, where we can frack and have a strategic reserve, or does that create some challenges for a China that needs to constantly grow? So I think we need to reevaluate that entire premise. So I think that all of those things tied together would be a comprehensive way of going after the China challenge. But it requires us doing things vastly differently. And quite frankly, it requires us to say that we can't do everything all at the same time. It requires us to say we can't confront China. We can't stay engaged in the Middle East at the same level, have a war with North Korea, and confront China at the same time. That is not strategy. That is a wish list, but it's never going to work.
Right. And the other thing, too, I think that's challenging, it's going to be a challenge, is that it's hard for us to have a long-term objective when we have different players in 2 and 4 year election cycles. And that's a natural challenge we're always going to have. But I think even more so where the foreign policies of, essentially the foreign policies of Reagan, Bush, and even Clinton to some extent were not all too dissimilar in the grand scheme. And, I think as we get more fractured on the domestic side, I think we're also going to be fractured more on the foreign policy side, and that could have disastrous consequences as well.
No, I think that's true because I think that there's not much support for what used to be the consensus foreign policy in the U.S. I would say that our entire post-World War II foreign policy, all the way through at least Clinton, was largely pretty similar. Now, actually, probably the biggest discontinuity was probably Nixon, actually. And actually, I go back to Nixon, and I actually think that we need a Nixonian foreign policy because Nixon, I think more than most presidents, understood that even if the United States was the single most powerful country in the world, we weren't omnipotent, and we couldn't do everything we wanted at all the times, and we needed to be smart about how we used diplomacy. He wasn't a dove by any means, but he also, I don't think, was as reflexively hawkish across the board as sometimes we think. And I think after the Soviet Union fell, America kind of thought, well, we can do anything anywhere. There's no more counterbalance to us. And so we've kind of gotten intellectually lazy in our policymaking circles. Now, if you ask academics, there's all kinds of ferment and debate in academia on what we should do in foreign policy. I mean, you've got people out there like the CKI, Charles Koch Institute, has done a lot to promote the work of an author named Barry Posen, who I think is from MIT. And he has a policy called restraint, where he's very much a trade with people, but don't be engaged militarily with stuff. And they've really been kind of pushing his stuff out there. In fact, they've also pushed out another scholar named John Mearsheimer, who is a well-known realist foreign policy thinker. But these are all academics. These aren't the actual policymakers. Our policymakers all kind of have the same basic viewpoint. And in this sense, Ben Rhodes was kind of right when he, for President Obama, called the D.C. foreign policy establishment the, quote, blob. They all have the same view. So while there's all this legitimate debate in academia, there really isn't that much debate amongst Republicans and Democrats. I mean, Democrats want to use the UN more, and they want to bomb people for humanitarian interventions. Republicans don't buy the UN as much, but they're willing to bomb people to democratize it. But they still sort of have the underlying premise that the whole way the world was when World War II ended is the way it should always be. And I think that the kind of policy I was talking about is a policy that recognizes that ain't going to happen. We have a competitive world. We have powers that are going to be very strong, that have a vastly different cultural experience. And we're not just talking about hundreds of years. We're talking about literally millennia. And we're going to have to navigate that world. And we need to be able to understand that it's not the post World War II era anymore. It's not even really the post Cold War era anymore. It's something different, and we better get used to that.
Absolutely. So yeah, this is a topic that's going to be more and more complex, and I'm sure that love to have you on more as some of these flashpoints with our relationship come up, and North Korea and South Korea, the South China Sea, like all these things, they're not going away anytime soon. This is going to be a continual challenge. So I appreciate you willing to come on here to delve into some of these and give our audience something to think about when it comes to foreign policy. So I appreciate you coming on and talking to us about that.
No, it was wonderful. I really appreciate the invitation, and thank you for your time too.
All right. So if you would like to get a hold of the show, as always, you can go to Money Power Pod at all of our socials and engage with us. What do you think about China? What do you think about the tariffs and this foreign policy and setting up a potentially adversarial relationship with China, or as Greg said it, setting it up to where we understand it's a global competitor and not just taking our hegemony for granted, so to speak. So, reach out to us on all the socials. We'd love to hear from you. As always, our episode is brought to you by Strike Force Energy. Strike Force Energy is a vitamin energy drink that does not have any crash. We highly recommend it, and it even tastes good. You can add it to your water or beverage of choice, whatever that beverage might be. So feel free to use the coupon code MAP, stands for Money and Power, for 20% off all orders at StrikeForceEnergy.com. Again, Strikeforce Energy is our sponsor for the show. All right, so now we come to the part of the show where we do our parting shots. So first, Rob.
All right, so my parting shot for this week has to do with a activist blogger who generally posts on Facebook called the Activist Mommy. So this is a fairly popular woman named Elizabeth Johnston, and she has over 600,000 followers on Facebook, so she is rather popular. The problem I have is that a lot of the things that she posts are propaganda, so it's things that are not confirmed, but she posts them out there as if they are true, and just kind of posts a question like, oh, I wonder if this is really the case. And then if you read what she writes on that, it seems like she definitely believes that's the case, even though there's no evidence. One of them had to do with a child sex trafficking through like one of the Clinton properties, and I was looking for the article, and I hope that she took it down, but I found it yesterday, but as I'm going through and recording this now, I can't seem to find it. So hopefully she took it down, because it was terrible, and it insinuated a lot of things that are that lack a severe amount of evidence to prove such a claim. But I think she has tapped into this right wing and I'm sure a smaller subsection like an alt-right wing where everyone is against Republicans and everyone who isn't a Republican is an enemy. And she has built her audience against that. Even a lot of the articles that she writes it's just frustrating. So I'm not saying don't ever follow her, don't ever read anything she says because it's all untrue. That's not the case. I just think that what she's doing isn't necessarily helpful to the dialogue for people who are looking for a good source of somewhat independent news. This is kind of the problem I have with Ben Shapiro's page. I like Ben Shapiro a lot. I think he's an intellectual giant on the conservative front. But he attracts a following that is really difficult to contend with. That's why I don't follow any of his pages or anything on social media as far as Facebook or Instagram, because usually engaging with people in the comment section doesn't really bode well if you disagree. Plus, a lot of the things that the Daily Wire posts are kind of like shock articles. And I have a similar complaint with them as I did with PragerU on our earlier episodes, is that they post a lot of who cares what this celebrity thinks unless it's a celebrity that agrees with me. And I know Shapiro doesn't agree with that, but with him being editor-in-chief, I wonder why that's being posted. And I think a lot of it has to do with it'll get more shares, it'll get more likes, it'll get more attention if that's the case. So I'm not a big fan of that. I would rather have less followers and better content than worse content and more followers. It's just not my style. I mean, I would rather have just a much more robust following that knows that there's truth in what I'm writing and posting, rather than posting things that are just getting clickbait views and shares and all that crap. So that is my parting shot. So I'm not really a big fan of people that use their platform to push things that aren't true just to get them more followers. And I don't have I don't know this Elizabeth Johnston, but it seems like that's her style, and I'm not a big fan of it. So that is my parting shot.
Greg, you have a parting shot?
Oh, well, I just think that it's to kind of conclude my thoughts before, we need to wake up. I think it's imperative that Americans really wake up to the challenge that we face, and that, we were talking about D-Day, and we were talking about what we accomplished on D-Day, and we were talking about Memorial Day and the importance of that. Everything those folks fought for, it's not over. The fight has transitioned. It's a different challenge. It is in a different format. But we have, I think, a responsibility to the folks who've done so much in the past and laid down even their lives, to not just, sleepwalk into a situation where we fumble away the advantages that their sacrifices have allowed us to be able to enjoy.
That's well said. Thank you very much. And, my parting shot is going to be along the same lines. We are Americans, and we have a wonderful legacy that's been given to us, and a debt that we can't possibly repay to those who have come before and laid down their lives for everything that we have for granted. Whether it's religious liberty, whether it's freedom of speech, whether it's the ability to kind of debate these things. Remember that there are others around the world that would take that and run with it, because they have no such thing. Think about what's happening to the citizens in China. We have the ability to wake up. We have the ability to confront this global competitor. They don't have the ability or even probably the hope to be able to tackle such things that we take for granted. The ability to use our phone without the government just eavesdropping, without violating our rights. And as much as we've talked about surveillance issues in the past and privacy issues, these issues are pale in comparison to those same concerns that are faced by our friends and in humanity who are overseas. And so, the next time that we're kind of squabbling about these issues together realize that there are these bigger issues to deal with, and that we need to all work together to achieve them. And so that's kind of my parting shot. You know what? We need to start having these conversations, and sometimes they're difficult, sometimes they're wonky, sometimes they're kind of policy heavy, but we need to start having these conversations because as Americans, we have to start working together instead of opposing each other on a consistent basis. The enemy is not our neighbor. The enemy isn't the person next door to us, the person in our community. The enemy is really, in this sense, complacency. And we have to work together to fight that, because if we don't, then we are going to be passing on a world to our children and our grandchildren that we just simply will wake up one day and not even recognize. So that is my parting shot. So thank you very much, Greg, for joining us. And thank you to all of you out there for listening. For Greg Lawson, for Rob Johnson, I am Nathan Martin. Thanks for listening.
I got the money in the pile. Yeah. Once you get a little, they just want to take you down, cuz we've been going hard for too long. Can't get enough, what is you on? Yeah. Really ain't nothing I could drop that.